Lewis, what are the most salient features of the crisis? What's it really about?
I think, James, this is a crisis which has been building for a long time. And I think it's been building about what the BBC itself understands impartiality to mean. And I think that in a way, you've already alluded to it, but this sort of latest twist with the censorship of Rutger Bregman's Dutch author and historian, who I'm sure of all august publications needs no introduction to the LRB's audience. But this question basically comes to what the BBC understands impartiality to mean. And by that, I mean that historically speaking, I think it's fair to say when the BBC was a more self-confident organisation and when its position within the broadcasting landscape was more hegemonic than it is now, and when the digital age had not yet begun, the BBC understood impartiality to not just be about the perception of impartiality, but the substance. I think some of the rot for this current crisis began when Tim Davie, who was a successful commercial manager of the BBC, but a poor editorial one, became Director General and started to talk about the idea that what mattered at least as much as the objective fact of impartiality was the perception of impartiality. And what that led to was a sort of internal culture at the BBC, which was as much about managing that perception as about managing the accuracy and the truth of the impartiality in the journalism that it was doing. And what I mean by that is to say that, you would end up in a situation, and I experienced this a few times when I was there, where basically almost the metric of success about a broadcast or about a piece of journalism almost started to feel as if we get through this and no one complains about it, almost if no one notices it, almost actually if it's so complicated and nebulous that no one really understands it, that is a definition of success. And of course, in terms of actual impartiality in journalism, what should matter most is that what you're doing is accurate and it is truthful. And if some people perceive that as being biased or whatever, then frankly, let them be damned. A more self-confident BBC would have had this attitude and once did have this attitude. It's an attitude that I fear has started to evaporate, at least from the management of the corporation. And frankly, I think we saw that on display at the Select Committee this week.
And what about this report, which has concentrated on the panorama flub, and I think it's hard to call it more than a flub, actually. I think you've made the argument in a Substack piece that the substance of the edit is not materially misleading about Trump's role in January the 6th and what happened afterwards. But it's not the only thing in the report. The report is concerned with some other impartiality issues too, Gaza and various other matters. It doesn't seem clear to me that it has actually taken into account quite a lot of the criticisms the BBC receives on the part of, its critics, both left and right. I wonder if you have something to say about the actors behind the scenes of this report. So you've criticised Robbie Gibb, who took a seat at the Select Committee yesterday to declare himself to be hugely impartial. It's a pleasingly Trumpian adjective there, and tells us that he has friends across the political divide. He has impartiality through his bones. Your colleague Emily Maitlis, newsagents, after she departed from the BBC, called Gibb an active agent of the Conservative Party. Is this a right-wing coup against the BBC?
I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And I think it for this reason, which is that, as you say, I know Robbie. He very, in an almost paternalistic fashion, was talking about how taking credit for my career at the Select Committee yesterday, which was nice. And I know some of the other sort of players involved. I genuinely think, and some people disagree with me about this, but I think that they are operating from the noblest of motives. I think that they think that the BBC is so riddled with a sort of institutional left bias that they, as the sort of sole custodians of a truer form of neutrality and impartiality, are saving the BBC from themselves. I thought there was a very telling moment yesterday when Michael Prescott, who of course was the author of this now sort of almost infamous dossier, sort of threw his hands up and said, I'm a sort of centrist dad, as if somehow that implied that he was beyond politics, that wasn't a form of politics. And this is something that I encountered a lot with some of these people, and that is too commonplace at the BBC and elsewhere in the media. It's not just a BBC thing. It's very commonplace across the BBC. There's a sort of certain spectrum of opinion that is self-described as either centrist or sometimes even centre-right, right through to the populist right, is somehow considered a kind of neutral form of politics. The true impartiality. Orthodoxies are for other people. And I think you could see that in the dossier itself. I would have had a lot more time for the Prescott dossier and for the work that the Editorial Standards Committee have done if there was a comprehensive and thorough assessment of the full gamut of impartiality critiques which is made against the BBC, some of which is true, some of which is false, some of which is sometimes true, depending on the circumstance. This is all inevitable. But of course it wasn't. As you say, James, it read like a sort of familiar hit list of the neuroses of the cultural radical right. Now, it's not to say that any of those things may not have had some substance in them. And I'm sure that if you pour through the thousands upon thousands of hours of BBC political coverage, you will be able to find things and items that do not meet the standards that you would like. As indeed that Panorama edit, relatively minor, but in and of itself did not. That is a different thing from an institutional bias in one direction, for which, again, I thought intriguingly and interestingly, when pressed on that yesterday, both Robbie Gibb and Michael Prescott were at pains to say that they didn't think there was an institutional bias, but there were, I think, what was the phrase, sort of incipient systemic biases. Now, what the difference is between those two things, I'm not sure, and unfortunately the Select Committee didn't seem to have the wherewithal to ask. But this is the sort of irony of this whole thing. When asked to provide evidence of these sort of systemic liberal left biases, usually answer comes there none. Or usually it is the sort of sense that there's an instinct or a hunch. What it actually is a bias and a prejudice and an assumption. And I'm not saying that no one at the BBC has these biases, by the way. I'm not saying that there won't be occasions when that has been true. But in my experience, two things were true. One is that what the BBC is probably guiltiest of at all, and Michael Prescott demonstrated it in his remarks yesterday, is a sort of stodgy establishment bias, a sort of bias to wherever the kind of received wisdom of the moment on any particular sort of political issue is. It tends to gravitate towards those things. And also, frankly, if we're talking about fear, the BBC does not fear institutionally the left in the same way that it fears the right. And as a result of that, the BBC is most alive to the critique that it is of a liberal left bias. And in my experience, therefore, many people were more alive to and more sensitive to checking biases to the liberal left than they were to the right. And just very quickly to give an example of that, I think, again, this lecture about Trump exemplifies that, right? Why do I say that? Well, let's just imagine for a moment that, say, Morris Glassman, who again is a figure I'm sure will be familiar to your listeners and readers, had been asked to give the Wreath Lecture this year about the flaws and demerits of progressive politics and of identity politics, and how the left and liberalism and progressivism had let down the very people that it sought to protect and to take care of. Now, I would have no problem, by the way, with the BBC commissioning that lecture. I'm sure it would be an arresting and provocative and interesting series of programmes. But I don't think anyone at the BBC would be doing too much pearl clutching about the idea that in somehow it represented a bias or a prejudice, or that the BBC was coming down on one argument or another. And yet here we are, and there are other circumstances we can talk about if you like, of course, but there are other circumstances around it. But here we are in a situation where the BBC is censoring a well-known academic for making a statement that I think, you could certainly argue is demonstrably, historically, true, that Trump is more openly corrupt than any other US president. And they're doing so partly for legal reasons, but partly because of this fear and of being perceived as being anti-Trump or liberal left.
I suppose, it struck me, and it has struck me throughout the coverage of this crisis, that there is a Kremlinological, well, that is a hard word to say, a Kremlinological quality to lots of the reporting here, where one is attempting to discern movements largely beneath the surface and read through kind of political motivations through this kind of network of actors who are sometimes exposed, sometimes not, sometimes reported on anonymously, sometimes reported largely through the consequence of their actions. And it's a very frustrating and difficult thing as simply a consumer of media to have to do, to reconstruct the power and the movement that's happening behind the scenes in situations like this. One of the things that strikes me is that it is homologous, at least, to the way that politics is reported on generally in this country, right? Journalists, of course, being very close, and certainly lobby journalists being very close to the people that they're reporting on, very willing to grant anonymity, very willing to grant sort of ideological rope, I think, to people who make political claims to them. I suppose the question I would put to you, and I'd like to hear Dan on this as well, is about ideological conformity. Because one of the things you're talking about is a kind of conformism, a strong herding instinct at work in political journalism. So, for instance, the way that the BBC's critics or the defenders portray the debate is that they get criticism from right and left. The criticism from the right is largely destructive. It wants to end or profoundly change the BBC. The criticism from the left, insofar as it goes, is that it basically wants to preserve the institution, but see it perform its role a little better. Dan, talk to me about ideology and conformity here. What has happened? Why do these people conceive of themselves as being in the political centre?
So, I mean, my sense is that the BBC is operating on a notion of balance that's derived from the days when you had a pretty clear-cut duopoly in Parliament, and balance and impartiality were to some extent conflated, right? If you gave both sides of the duopoly's positions, then the BBC was doing its job, and that. There was an enormous amount of horseplay going on. There was a huge amount of toing and froing about who was being treated fairly and so on. But that epistemic deference to Parliament kind of made the game of delivering a plausibly impartial account of the political much more easy. The problems the BBC is in now are they are coincident, obviously, with major changes in the media. It's never been more easy to criticise the BBC in real time, to criticise other large media institutions in real time. That makes a real impact, I think, on their ability, as you say, James, to present themselves as almost like sheer-faced Kremlins that no one could really understand, right? Unless you were inside them, you couldn't speak authoritatively about the media, and I think that is breaking down to some extent. But the other issue that the BBC is dealing with touches on your introduction, where we are at the end of, I think, a long period in British statecraft, which begins round about 1979 with the advent of the Thatcherite kind of counter-revolution. And we've had essentially Thatcherite governance in this country for the last, whatever it is now, 45 years. And I think that period, one way or another, is coming to an end. And this is causing has huge implications. We've seen the defection of Scotland from the Westminster duopoly. We're now seeing the defection of Wales from the Westminster duopoly. You're seeing the emergence of real challenges to the Conservative Party on the right in reform, and real challenges to the Labour Party on the left in the shape of the Green Party. And so this old model of a seesaw where you could basically find a fixed point between left and right, or liberal and conservative. And by the way, the conflation of those four terms is very interesting. It would be interesting to see where exactly that begins to happen so naturally, because often you see a discussion that is between social conservatism and social liberalism, which is presented and translated as though it's an argument between left and right, and those things aren't quite the same, right? And one of the ways in which I think the BBC does fail is in its inability particularly to process left-wing critiques in the zone of political economy. It's extremely difficult, I think, for the BBC to cope with this new environment because, as I say, you're not trying to balance a broadly centre-left and a broadly centre-right. You're balancing a decohering Westminster scene, and you're doing that in the context of a decohering media environment, right? And this is a major issue for the BBC.
Just to jump in on that, I think it would be an interesting question to pose to you, Lewis. So you have these two systems which are pulling apart. The media environment is profoundly different, I think, to you and I are around the same age, to when both of us were growing up, in which there was a hugely hegemonic central broadcaster with sort of little things running around the sides. That picture has changed very, very profoundly. And of course, the political picture is changing extremely rapidly. It was easy in those old days to go into work and know more or less how to float above that scene. Do you feel yourself being pulled in every which direction when you come to cover this stuff? How do you find the balance to make adequate critique, but also give adequate room to the arguments that people are making? Are you impartial when you come to work?
So, I mean, there's a lot in there. So just on the just on the question of I want to just pick up something Daniel said there about sort of the changing environment, because I think it's completely correct, and I think there's another element to it as well, which the BBC is not having to reckon with now, but did under the Johnson government in particular, and could well again, which is this: one of the reasons that the impartiality model, as it has been understood and practiced by the BBC for a long time, has started to break down, is because not only did it deal best with a two-party, with a duopoly pretty much, or a 2.5-party system, and not only did it deal best when the primary questions of politics were still largely economic and distributive as opposed to cultural, when, you could basically talk about the kind of, the sort of slice of the national pie, and the question of politics was basically about how to distribute those resources. It could deal with those things quite well. But it also dealt best with a political scene where you had political actors who, broadly speaking, were institutionalist and played by a certain set of rules. And what it profoundly started to struggle with, and continues to struggle with, is in the populist age, when you have anti-system candidates and anti-system politicians and parties who do not wish to play by those old established codes and rules, and who indeed predicate their entire politics on not doing so. So a great example is when I was covering then, at the time I was at Sky at the time, but the BBC was grappling with it as well, was about Boris Johnson and prorogation. Now, the BBC, normally this would not have been a question or a problem that it would have had to deal with. Theresa May would never have prorogued Parliament in that way. It was put to her, she decided not to do it. Boris Johnson did. That left the BBC with a fundamental question, which it probably did not grapple with enough at the time, which is, you say, is this just a normal political issue when there is a set of people in favour of it and a set of people who are not in favour of it? Is there a binary? Or is it something which the BBC, in its editorial guidelines, says we are committed to the values of parliamentary democracy? Is it something which needs to be reported on more robustly? Do you say that this is constitutionally improper and wrong? And you see this same set of dilemmas recur in different areas. And indeed you saw it at the Select Committee this week, when again you saw Michael Prescott, who actually had not worked at the BBC, and in my view showed a pretty hollow view of what an understanding of what impartiality is, a sort of ersatz impartiality, when he talked about the idea that he thought the Panorama programme might have been fine if there had been another programme about Kamala Harris, which was sort of equally tough on her. And of course, this sort of like Potemkin impartiality is weird, right? Because you're sat there going, well, hang on a minute. The whole premise of the programme was examining Donald Trump's record in office, and in particular his attempt to overthrow or overturn the 2020 election. It hardly needs stating Kamala Harris didn't have a record to defend and hadn't tried to overturn an election. And so this is an example of what I'm sort of trying to get at, which is that, this is not the normal set of editorial dilemmas and questions with which the BBC has had to grapple ever before, really, in its existence. And it hasn't, even though we've had sort of 10 years of this sort of politics now, it hasn't tried to grapple with it, because actually the questions that it probably leads you to are too difficult. Just on that second question about impartiality, I feel now that in a way I can be more impartial than I was at the BBC. And as I've said before, I think the kind of impartiality model, I wonder full stop, and this is probably another element that we can sort of maybe talk about, but I do think that the impartiality model actually, as historically understood, which is that, we sort of pretended that BBC journalists had no politics and, the best thing you could do with a BBC journalist is not be able to know how they vote. I think that is quite an old-fashioned sort of sense because I think audiences are more sophisticated now. I think they knew that insofar that was ever true, that it's nonsense. But what matters is, and this is where someone like Robbie and I would part company, what matters is not that you don't have politics. It would be weird if you were a political journalist and you didn't have politics. What matters is that the audience can be confident that if you do have that there can be cognizance of your politics and still that you are coming to a set of conclusions that as far as possible is as fair and duly impartial as possible. So in answer to your question, I feel I am able to be I am better able now to be duly impartial because I am not concerned with or worried about managing the perception of impartiality, i.e. getting a call from some BBC boss at the end of the day going, not really taking issue, and this happened many times, not taking issue really with the substance of what I was saying, but taking issue with the potential for someone, perhaps at the heart of politics, to take issue with it or complain about it, and how do we mitigate their doing so. So I feel that I'm better able now to do that than I was before.